A mother remains motionless on a jagged rock. Her fixed gaze pierces the horizon, while the sun punishes her skin. Around her, 7 bodies stretched out on the stone. Above, vultures circle patiently. The woman raises her staff, driving away another bird of prey that dares to approach. This scene didn't unfold for just one day. Not for a week, not for a month. Rizpah remained like this for 6 long months, tirelessly protecting the remains of her sons and relatives, exposed as an example after an execution ordered by the king. How many times have you heard about a mother's devotion? About stories of maternal sacrifice that go beyond the limits of what seems possible? Rizpah's story surpasses any normal measure of love. This royal concubine, overlooked by many Bible readers, carried out one of the most extraordinary acts of maternal devotion ever recorded in the sacred scriptures. What would drive a woman to live among corpses for half a year, facing the scorching heat of day and the biting cold of night? How did her solitary vigil end up touching even the hardened heart of a king? And why does this story, so powerful and moving, remain unknown to so many? This story brings a perspective on love and perseverance that few know. A story about how a silent act of defiance can have more power than entire armies. A story about how an ordinary mother transformed her grief into a protest so powerful that it changed the course of a nation's history. To understand the magnitude of Rizpah's sacrifice, we need to go back in time to ancient Israel, approximately 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. The country, finally unified under the monarchy, was experiencing a period of relative stability after years of internal wars. David, the second king of Israel, ruled from Jerusalem, the newly conquered city he had established as the capital. Imagine a land of arid hills and fertile valleys, a landscape where the day's heat could burn your skin and the night's cold could freeze your bones. A land where water was as precious as gold and where hunger was always lurking, waiting for a drought to devastate entire communities. In this setting lived Rizpah, a woman whose name means hot stone or burning coal, a foreshadowing of the heat of her devotion. Rizpah wasn't an ordinary woman. She had been a concubine of King Saul, Israel's first monarch, which gave her status and privileges. Imagine life in a royal palace of that time, not the luxury we associate with modern monarchies, but certainly a life of relative comfort compared to most of the population. As a royal concubine, Rizpah had given birth to 2 sons for Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, not to be confused with another Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who was spared by David. Her sons grew up as princes, with expectations of prominent positions in the kingdom. But fate had taken a tragic turn for the house of Saul. The king, after reigning for decades, had fallen from grace in God's eyes, according to biblical texts. Saul and most of his sons died in battle against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. The kingdom passed into the hands of David, Saul's former protege who later became his rival. Rizpah then found herself in a precarious position, a royal widow whose patron was no longer in power. Her situation was similar to that of many women who, after losing their powerful husbands, suddenly found themselves vulnerable, dependent on the kindness or indifference of the new regime. Years passed. David consolidated his power. The house of Saul was nearly wiped out in the battles for the throne, with few survivors scattered. Rizpah managed to maintain herself and raise her sons, who were already grown men when a natural tragedy struck the land of Israel, a devastating drought that lasted 3 long years. Crops failed, wells dried up, livestock died, people began to starve. In the ancient mindset of Israel, natural calamities like this were always seen as divine punishment for some unexpiated sin, some unrepaired injustice. It was in this context of national desperation that King David sought the face of the Lord, as the biblical text says. The answer he received pointed to an unrectified crime. Saul had broken an ancient covenant with the Gibeonites, a native people who had made a peace agreement with Israel in the times of Joshua, about 200 years earlier. Saul, in his nationalistic zeal, had tried to exterminate the Gibeonites, violating the sacred oath made by his ancestors. This was the backdrop when Rizpah's life would take its most tragic turn. A country desperate for rain, a king seeking to appease divine wrath, and a foreign people demanding vengeance for the blood of their ancestors. When David consulted the Gibeonites about how he could compensate them for the injustice they had suffered, the answer was grim and direct. They didn't want gold or silver. They didn't want lands or privileges. They wanted blood, 7 male descendants from the house of Saul to be publicly executed as retribution for the deaths of their people. David agreed to the demand, perhaps due to political pressure, perhaps because he truly believed this was divine will, or perhaps, as some scholars suggest, because he saw a convenient opportunity to eliminate potential rivals to the throne. Regardless of his motivations, the result was that 7 men were selected to die. Among the chosen were Rizpah's 2 sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth. Along with them 5 of Saul's grandsons, sons of his daughter Merab, completed the number demanded by the Gibeonites. David spared only Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, because of the friendship oath he had made to his father. We can only imagine the moment when Rizpah received the news her sons, now adult men, would be taken away and killed not for crimes they had committed, but for actions of their deceased father. There was no appeals court. There was no one to turn to. The king's decision, allegedly based on divine will, was final. The 7 men were handed over to the Gibeonites at the beginning of the barley harvest, in mid-April. They received no formal trial. They had no chance to defend themselves. They were simply taken to the hill of Gibeah, Saul's hometown, and brutally executed. The chosen method of execution was particularly cruel. They weren't simply killed and buried. They were exposed before the Lord, as the biblical text says. This meant their bodies were hung, probably on crosses or stakes, exposed to the sun and the elements, denying them the basic right to dignified burial, a terrible disgrace in the culture of the ancient Near East. Normally, even executed criminals should be buried before sunset, according to Mosaic law, but this was no ordinary execution. It was an expiatory sacrifice, an offering to end the drought. The bodies would remain exposed until rain came, a sign that God had accepted the sacrifice and forgiven the land. It was at this point that Rizpah made her extraordinary decision. Where others would have retreated to mourn in private, where others would have accepted the terrible reality and tried to move on with their shattered lives, Rizpah refused to abandon her sons even in death. She took a sackcloth, a rough fabric used in mourning rituals, and spread it on a rock near the exposed bodies of her sons and the other 5 men. There she established her solitary vigil. Day after day, Rizpah remained at the foot of those crosses or stakes. Under the scorching sun, she drove away the vultures and other birds of prey that came to peck at the corpses. During the night, she kept away the jackals and other wild animals that smelled death. A mother alone, armed only with a staff and her fierce determination, did what an army could not do. She preserved the dignity of her dead sons, refusing to allow their bodies to be desecrated beyond the humiliation they had already suffered. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Rizpah's body darkened under the relentless sun. Her skin dried out. Her lips cracked from thirst. Her stomach rumbled with hunger. But she did not abandon her post. Occasionally, some compassionate traveler might bring her water or food. Perhaps some locals, touched by her devotion, silently helped. But essentially, she was alone in her vigil. Think about the physical horror of the situation, the decomposing bodies, the nauseating smell that must have permeated her clothes and skin, the insects that swarmed around, the constant sound of beating wings from vultures circling above, the sight of beloved faces becoming unrecognizable with the passage of time. Think about the psychological trauma, seeing the sons she had carried in her womb, nursed, raised, and loved, reduced to carcasses exposed as a public lesson, hearing people passing by, perhaps mocking, perhaps looking with pity, but no one interfering to help, and still Rizpah remained. Her vigil began in April, with the barley harvest. It continued through the hot summer months, when Israel's sun is most merciless. It extended into early autumn, when nights begin to cool. Only when the first rains fell, in October, could her vigil end, approximately 6 months after it began. During all this time, Rizpah's story was spreading. Travelers passing along the road told about the strange and moving sight of the woman protecting the dead. Caravans carried her story to distant villages and cities. In marketplaces, at wells where women fetched water, at city gates where men gathered to talk, Rizpah's name was mentioned with amazement and respect. Have you heard about Saul's concubine? She's still there guarding the bones of her sons. Inevitably, the story reached the ears of King David in Jerusalem. The powerful monarch, who had agreed to the sacrifice of the 7 men, heard about a mother whose devotion defied human understanding, and then something unexpected happened. The king's heart was touched. What many people don't know is that Rizpah's vigil had an impact far beyond what we might imagine. Her silent protest not only preserved the bodies of her sons, it ended up changing the heart of a king and leading to an act of national redemption rarely mentioned in Sunday school classes. When David learned of Rizpah's tireless vigil, something extraordinary happened. The biblical text is simple but profound. They told David what Rizpah had done. Then David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son. What we're seeing here is a complete change of attitude. The same king who had handed over 7 men to be executed and left exposed was now personally involved in giving them a dignified burial. Even more, David went beyond. He not only ordered that the bodies of the 7 executed men be finally buried, he retrieved the remains of Saul and Jonathan, which had been hastily buried in Jabesh-Gilead since their death in battle years before. David gathered all these remains in a single location, the tomb of Kish's family, Saul's father, in the land of Benjamin. It was a state funeral for those who had been treated as criminals and traitors, a restoration of honor for the fallen house of Saul. The biblical text ends this passage with a significant observation. After that, God heeded the prayers for the land. The rain finally fell, the drought ended, the famine ceased, life could begin again. This often overlooked detail reveals something profound about the spirituality presented in the text. It wasn't the bloody sacrifice of the 7 men that appeased divine wrath, as initially thought. It was the act of justice and dignity, inspired by a mother's devotion, that finally brought reconciliation. Few Bible readers realize how radical this revelation is in the context of antiquity. In a world where human sacrifices were still practiced by neighboring peoples, where retributive violence was the norm, this story subtly suggests that what truly pleases God is not the shedding of blood, but the restoration of human dignity. Another rarely explored aspect of this story is the fact that Rizpah, being Saul's concubine, likely had non-Israelite origins. Many royal concubines were foreigners, often women captured in battles or given as diplomatic gifts. If this is the case, we have here a possibly non-Israelite woman teaching the king of Israel the true meaning of devotion and justice. There is also a fascinating political dimension to this story. The house of Saul and the house of David had been rivals for the throne. The civil war that followed Saul's death had divided the nation. By publicly honoring the remains of Saul and his family with a dignified burial, David was effectively closing this chapter of Israel's history, allowing the wounds of civil war to begin healing. Rizpah's solitary courage, therefore, had consequences that extended far beyond protecting the bodies of her sons. Her act of maternal love ended up functioning as a catalyst for national reconciliation. Through her public, stubborn and tireless mourning, she forced the entire nation to confront an injustice that everyone preferred to ignore. And perhaps the most surprising aspect of this story, Rizpah achieved all this without uttering a single recorded word. Unlike prophets who cried out in the squares, unlike kings who issued decrees, unlike priests who interpreted the law, Rizpah let her actions speak. Her body, placed between the vultures and the remains of her sons, became her sermon. Her silent and stubborn presence became her protest, and that screaming silence ended up being more eloquent than 1,000 speeches. What few also know is that Rizpah's story appears at a crucial moment in the biblical narrative. It emerges at the end of David's reign, shortly before the revolt of his son Absalom and other internal conflicts that nearly destroyed his kingdom. Some scholars suggest that the inclusion of this story serves as a veiled critique of David's policies, showing how even the man after God's own heart could be blind to injustices when they served his political interests. Rizpah teaches us that resistance doesn't always need to be loud to be effective. That silent persistence can be more powerful than open rebellion. That selfless devotion can move mountains that anger and violence cannot shake. To discover more fascinating stories like this, just subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. Stories of forgotten characters in the margins of the biblical text, whose lives contain surprisingly relevant lessons for our days. Rizpah's story echoes through the centuries because it touches something fundamental in the human experience: love that defies death, persistence that defies power, dignity that defies humiliation. How many times in our own lives do we face situations that seem completely hopeless? How many times do we feel powerless in the face of the overwhelming forces of politics, nature, social injustice? Rizpah shows us that even when we cannot change the fact of death, we can refuse to accept the denial of dignity that often accompanies it. In our modern world, we still see Rizpahs emerging in various contexts: mothers searching for the remains of children who disappeared under authoritarian regimes, communities keeping vigil for their dead after natural disasters neglected by the powerful, individuals who refuse to allow the names of their loved ones to be forgotten or dishonored. Rizpah's story reminds us that power doesn't always reside in palaces or armies. Sometimes the most transformative power comes from the persistence of an ordinary person who refuses to accept that the last word should be injustice or dehumanization. At the beginning of this story, we asked what could lead a woman to live among corpses for half a year, facing the relentless elements of nature. Now we know, it wasn't just maternal love, though that was its foundation. It was the refusal to participate in the dehumanization of her sons. It was the determination to force a society to confront the real human consequences of abstract political decisions. We asked how her solitary vigil ended up touching even the hardened heart of a king. The answer lies in the unarmed power of embodied truth. David could ignore arguments, he could reject petitions, he could silence criticism, but he couldn't escape the persistent truth of a mother who wouldn't go away, a mother whose unwavering love exposed the inadequacy of merely political justice. And we asked why this story remains unknown to so many. Perhaps because it challenges us deeply. It challenges our tendency to accept quick solutions for complex problems. It challenges our willingness to sacrifice real individuals for abstractions like reason of state or greater good. It challenges our ease in forgetting the human costs of public policies. Rizpah, whose name means hot stone or burning coal, continues to burn through the centuries. Her fierce love, her refusal to accept the unacceptable, her persistence beyond all reasonable limits, all of this illuminates a path for anyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of overwhelming forces. The story ends with a simple observation: after this, God answered prayer on behalf of the land. But the true conclusion goes beyond. Through an ordinary woman who refused to accept the place assigned to her, who refused to weep silently backstage while injustice unfolded on the main stage, a nation found its way back not just to reign but to its humanity. If the vultures of injustice, dehumanization or forgetfulness circle over something you consider sacred, remember Rizpah. Sometimes the most powerful act is not moving mountains, but simply refusing to leave a place.